If there was any indication that you could make the world a better place, would you relentlessly try? Because that question sits right at the heart of Malcolm Gladwell's Revenge of the Tipping Point. He uses the history of the opioid crisis in America to showcase the passive response of a company. And as we start understanding the elements of social epidemics, he nails the coffin shut when bringing these elements back to the progression and history of the opioid crisis. Back in 2000, Malcolm Gladwell released The Tipping Point. That book was almost like an optimism machine. Its thesis was simple but powerful. Small things, in the right hands, at the right moment, can change the world. People read the book as a toolkit for good. Marketers used it. Psychologists used it. Behavioral scientists used it. It showed how ideas, trends, and behaviors could spread like epidemics, and how small changes could create massive positive impact. But 20 years later, Gladwell returns with a new question. Why revenge? Because this mechanism, the tipping point, itself, does not care. Tipping points are morally neutral. They amplify whatever is loaded into them. I will repeat, they amplify what is loaded into them. Hope, innovation, connection, but also manipulation, contagion, exploitation. The same mechanics that can propel progress can also accelerate outcomes we never intended. The author steps us through the elements of social epidemics by looking at certain non-fiction stories, research and studies he uses to explain the elements of social epidemics. Element number 1, the overstory. Gladwell explains the first element of social epidemics, using a concept borrowed from forestry, the overstory. In a forest, the overstory is the canopy formed by the tallest trees. Their branches control the light, temperature, and moisture for everything growing below. Gladwell uses this as a metaphor for society. The overstory is the shared narrative above us, the environment of norms, beliefs, and stories that quietly shape how people behave. And once you start looking for overstories, you begin to see them everywhere. I've broken several of Gladwell's examples down in the Shorts playlist, linked before, stories like The Trouble with the LA Survivors Club, and Doing Time on Maple Drive. But there's another fascinating twist Gladwell points out, something called small area variation. Two completely different overstories can exist right next to each other. People living side by side may behave entirely differently, not because they are different people, but because they live under different social canopies. And we'll soon see how this very idea shows up again, in the story of the opioid crisis. The second element Gladwell introduces is group proportions. Sometimes cultures don't change gradually. They flip. And that flip often happens when a minority reaches a critical threshold, not a majority. Just enough people for the dynamics of the group to suddenly shift. Gladwell explores this idea through several fascinating examples, and I've broken many of them down in the Shorts playlist. For instance, what happens when a system becomes a monoculture, where everyone behaves the same and thinks the same? Why do such systems collapse so easily? What happens when a minority reaches the magic quarter, or the magic third, that moment when influence suddenly starts to compound? Why did something that once felt politically impossible, like gay marriage in the early 2000s, suddenly become culturally inevitable? And how did something as simple as a television show like Will and Grace quietly shift public acceptance? These examples reveal how small shifts in group composition can suddenly transform the behavior of an entire culture. And as we'll soon see, those same dynamics played a role in the rise of the opioid crisis. The third element Gladwell explores is superspreaders. When we imagine epidemics, social or biological, we tend to think they spread evenly across a population. But they don't. Most epidemics are profoundly asymmetrical. A tiny number of people drive a disproportionate amount of the spread. What Gladwell calls the law of the very, very, very few. And once you start looking for superspreaders, you begin to see them everywhere. In the Shorts playlist, I break down some of Gladwell's examples, like Casper and the Sea Dog, a bank robber who helped ignite a wave of robberies across Los Angeles, or Mr. Index and the Marriott outbreak, where one person in early 2020 was linked to hundreds of thousands of COVID infections. How can one person create that kind of ripple effect? And why do some individuals become powerful transmission points, while most people do not? Because once you understand how superspreaders work, you start to see how a small number of actors can accelerate an entire epidemic. And as we'll soon see, this principle played a decisive role in the rise of the opioid crisis. While reading this book, the channel admin created a series of chapter shorts capturing the key concepts, evidence, and insights along the way. You can return to that playlist at any time as you move through this review. The book starts with the scenario of a Zoom call, where a group of politicians gather information from the executives from the company Purdue related to their product OxyContin. The interrogations from the politicians are ruthless. Do you think you could have prevented it? Will you apologize to the American people? The answers are passive at most. Every executive makes mild, politically correct statements. balanced in empathy, and no finger-pointing to them. It was outside their control, their products was abused, they could do nothing, really. Then how did a bureaucrat from the 1930s manage to slow this epidemic decades before it even began? Let's examine the beginning of the opioid crisis through the lens of the overstory. Why were some communities devastated while others were barely touched? What determined who became vulnerable and who didn't? To answer that, we need to return to the overstory, the invisible environment that shapes how epidemics spread. Data points started emerging. Questions abound. How then does this crisis make a 360-degree turn at a state line? Remember the overstory question. How did a 1930s bureaucrat affect the recent opioid crisis? His name was Paul Madden. In 1939, he became the director of the CA Bureau of Narcotic Enforcement. Something else you should know about Madden is that he was a staunch anti-drug crusader. He spent years profiling drug users and abusers, and spent most of his time in office to understand how drug abuse can be minimized or even, by his wild ambitions, stopped. He made prescribing harder and more visible. Agree or don't? Madden implemented the triplicate protocol for all drugs with opioid components in his states. Doctors was forced to prescribe opioids on a separate triplicate prescription pad, and that one additional script was mailed to the government. And so he transforms prescribing opioids from a private act into a highly monitored act. The start of an overstory. A concern already started growing in the 1960s over prescription drug abuse. Other states started adopting the triplicate rules between the 1960s and 1980s for Schedule II controlled substances. States also applied it because there was a clear correlation between the triplicate law and reduction of falsified and forged prescriptions, and it gave law enforcement concrete data on high-risk prescribers and pharmacies. These states included Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, New York, Texas, Hawaii, and Rhode Island. There was also another overstory rearing its head. In the 1980s, Dr. Russell began promoting a very different approach to treating pain. He became a central figure in reshaping the medical establishment's approach to pain management. Pain is not merely a symptom of an underlying disease, it is an illness in itself, deserving treatment. Why should the medical profession allow patients to suffer needlessly? He starts the revolutionary idea that doctors should not be afraid to prescribe opioids for non-cancer pain. The scale starts tipping. By the mid-1990s, only 5 states remain strictly under triplicate rule: Texas, California, New York, Illinois, Idaho. The rest is empowered by the Portnoy theory and charges ahead with aggressive treatments. By the mid-1990s, Purdue Pharma was preparing to launch a new drug, OxyContin. But before rolling it out nationwide, they ran extensive research with doctors. What they discovered was surprising. The medical landscape was deeply divided. In focus groups, doctors in triplicate states showed anxiety and fear of government tracking, prescribing almost no Schedule II narcotics. Non-triplicate state doctors were enthusiastic, empowered to prescribe, and highly likely to use the new drug. Here starts the engineering. The focus groups provide information that provides the strategic divergence. Purdue decides not to waste resources in triplicate states. The sales army strictly targets the unprotected states. The result was small area variation. Illinois, a triplicate state, had 366 opioid doses per capita. Indiana, a non-triplicate state with identical demographics, had 756.6 doses per capita. The geographic borders created double the devastation. The differentiator? The triplicate or non-triplicate status of the state. States that maintained Madden's bureaucratic friction maintained cultural immunity to Purdue Pharma's marketing. So there are these thick, lush overstories when Purdue starts their marketing of OxyContin. Could that be the whole story? Of course not. Let's talk superspreaders. Whilst initially following the, quote, pinball wizard sales model, where sales representatives bounced around randomly from doctor to doctor, they now pivoted. On realizing sales of Oxy started stalling, Purdue hired McKinsey Consulting to rethink their strategy. McKinsey analyzed prescribing data and segment doctors in 10 deciles, revealing profound asymmetry in how opioids were distributed. They discovered that the bottom 62% of doctors wrote an average of only 1% of Oxy prescriptions. Conversely, the top 358 doctors, representing only 0.2% of physicians, wrote an average of 246 prescriptions a month. McKinsey advised Purdue to completely ignore the doctors in the lower underperforming deciles, and to instead focus their sales army entirely on the core and supercore prescribers at the very top. Purdue weaponized the superspreaders. They visited supercore doctors at least twice a month. They fiercely cultivated relationships with the outliers. For instance, Dr. Michael Rhodes. He wrote 297 oxy prescriptions in 2007. However, after Purdue sales visited him 126 times, his prescriptions rocketed to 1307 by 2010. The impacts. The epidemic was ultimately propelled by a microscopic fraction of the medical community. Epidemiologist Matthew Kiang calculated that the top 1% of doctors accounted for an astonishing 49% of all opioid doses. This brings us to the last element of a social epidemic, but here definitely the most potent one. Group proportions. While the superspreaders ignited the epidemic, a disastrous miscalculation regarding group proportions made it exponentially deadlier. In the summer of 2010, Purdue retired the original OxyContin and replaced it with a crush-proof reformulation called OxyContin OP. For over a decade, users had been crushing the pills to snort them, getting 12 hours worth of opioids in a single, intense high. The new pill had the consistency of a gummy bear and could no longer be snorted. Health officials and economists initially welcomed the change, assuming that the group proportions of the crisis were relatively fixed. They believed that prescription drug addicts were a distinct demographic, people with jobs and homes who would simply stop using the drug rather than make the massive leap to purchasing illicit heroin on the street. They were tragically wrong, as epidemics are acutely sensitive to shifts in their internal group proportions. The results of the reformulation were catastrophic. Instead of curing the addiction, the reformulation abruptly shifted the massive population of users away from regulated prescription pills. Users simply switched to heroin, and later to synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Because they could no longer snort the drug, users began injecting heroin, which is 100 times more dangerous, and exposes users to HIV, hepatitis, and deadly infections. Between 2011 and 2017, the number of fatal overdoses from heroin went up 350%, and fentanyl deaths skyrocketed 22-fold. A counterfactual study by economists David Powell and Rosalie Picula showed that if Purdue had never reformulated OxyContin, the overdose rate would have actually begun to decline due to other policy improvements. Instead, the reformulation increased overdose rates by more than 100%, compared to what would have happened if things had stayed the same. A comparative study conducted by economist Abby Alpert estimates that at least 27,000 lives was saved in New York alone due to its triplicate prescription laws. That is, at least 27,000 mothers, fathers, daughters, and sons saved by Paul Madden's prescription laws started as an overstory in 1939. Could we now believe the weak stories spinned by the Purdue executives to the politicians in the introduction to this book? We can never go back, but we can always learn and adapt. The power of reviewing what we know about social epidemics and social engineering. Could you spot any rising social epidemics or social engineering near you? Could you spot the elements? Could you adapt to the lessons?